Ruy Lopez is a super classical opening. It's been played basically every day at the elite, but also for beginners is very friendly. So this is an opening that we see every day at every level. So either you play it with white pieces or you face it with black. This video is going to be very well because we are going to understand Ruy Lopez move by move. I'm going to explain every move, the idea behind why is that so strong, why is the most common move in that specific position. But also I'm going to give you options, like interesting alternatives in some positions, so you can surprise your opponents. You can change the lines that you play from time to time, and also I will give you fun and historical facts around Ruy Lopez opening. For example, did you know that this opening is named after a Spanish priest named Ruy Lopez de Segura? Let's get started. So e4, e5, knight to f3, and then knight to c6. And in this position, bishop to b5, we are in Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. Also, some people call this the Spanish torture due to the difficulty for black in achieving equality in some lines. So this move bishop b5 is attacking the defender of the central pawn on e5. So at some point, the move bishop takes knight, removing that defender, followed by the capture of the pawn, might be a threat. We're going to see it once we advance in the line. Also, let me tell you, right now it's not a real threat. For example, after a6, bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and knight takes pawn. This is not really a good thing for white. Here, black can play queen d4, it's a fork, and then we get the pawn back. So after knight f3, then queen takes e4, and this position is actually good for black. So that's why in this position, bishop b5, we are not really threatening immediately bishop takes knight, but it's going to be a threat eventually in the opening. Once you castle, once you develop your pieces, it's going to be a real threat. At this point in the opening, black has some options. The most normal move is going to be a6, Morphy defense, but also let me show you some alternatives for black in this position. There is this line we call Schliemann with f5. It's very interesting, very dynamic, aggressive, and it's an interesting option for attack players. Also, we have another variation here that I really like, and it is knight e7, and this is Cosillo defense. The idea with this line is very simple. Just develop your knight, get ready to recapture with the knight, and keep the pawn defended if necessary. Develop your bishop over the fianchetto castle, and play a normal opening. Just develop your pieces and improve your position naturally. Another thing we should look at in this position as an alternative to Morphy defense is going to be Berlin defense. This line has been popularized in the match Kraknik versus Kasparov for the World Championship, and it's actually interesting. They still play it in World Championships, but the problem for normal players like us is that this line is very dry. So very often this leads to a trade of queens very early, so we're playing some kind of endgame or some kind of mid game without queens, and some people might say it's a little boring. So if you don't like that kind of position, then Berlin defense is not a really good option here. Let me show you what happens. Usually white castles, then knight takes e4, d4 is the best move here, and then we attack the bishop, and then the bishop takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, and then knight moves, and there's a trade of queens. This is what I was saying. This is like some kind of mid game without queens here, but well, with all due respect to Berlin defense lovers, this position without queens is somewhat boring. Although if you're a more positional or slow player, of course, we can still find joy in this kind of lines. So those are some of the alternatives for black in this position. Also, there is the 6 Steinitz defense, but actually the main line is going to be here, pawn to a6, Morphy defense. Which is the idea of this move? Well, basically you're asking the question to the bishop, what are you going to do? Are you going to retreat, or are you going to get traded for the knight? The main line is bishop a4, but actually, let me tell you, there is this exchange variation with bishop takes c6, and it's still very playable and very interesting. The idea of the exchange variation is that you want to damage the pawn structure in black's position, and you might be able to take advantage of that maybe later. So here there are two different approaches for white. White can just stay in the middle game, for example, by castling here, and they are ahead in development. Observe they already developed a knight, and the king is already castled, as black pieces are still at the initial position. So they are ahead, definitely, in development, and they will try to take advantage of that. But the problem is that, well, as you can see, white lost the 2 bishops with this trade on c6. So the 2 bishops is something serious, it's something interesting for black. So the position is more or less complicated, unclear, and anything can happen here. Usually black defends here with f6. Of course, they are weakening a little the light squares, but guess what? White does not have a light squares bishop. So that's why f6 is totally okay. The bishop is going to make it up, controlling all these squares later. So it's all good for black here, totally playable, still an interesting line. So that's one approach in the exchange variation. The other approach is to try to go to the endgame. So instead of playing a middle game with development advantage, white can trade pieces and play an endgame where black has some problems with the pawn structure. So let me show you. They can play d4, pawn takes, queen takes, and then after queen takes, knight takes, queen. What happens here? White has a better pawn structure, but again, black has the 2 bishops. This endgame is going to be very interesting. Let me tell you, I have a video in my channel about how to play this line with white pieces. It can be really powerful if you know the plans and the ideas for white, because very often black does not understand the position very well, especially among beginners, intermediate players. This can be a very powerful weapon if you understand the position. So check out that video and you can win many games understanding the strategy of how to play with white this kind of endgames with a better pawn structure. Well, that being said, that's the exchange variation. The most normal move is just retreat the bishop to a4, keep it there. But also the idea with a6 in this line is that now black can get rid of the pin whenever they want. So at some point they can play b5 if there is too much pressure, if they need. Well, they know they have the option of getting rid of that pressure on c6. So what is going to happen next? Well, black needs to continue developing pieces, so the move knight f6 is more or less mandatory here. And at this point, white has some options. The main line is going to be castle kingside, but I'm going to talk about 2 different options here for white. One option is d3, totally natural development. The knight is attacking the pawn on e4, so you just defend it with your pawn on d3, which is the drawback of this line. The drawback is that you're not playing d4. So if you play d3, that means that you're not going to aim for d4, or if at some point you actually play it, you lost 1 tempo trying to get that. So in general, they will try to play c3 and d4 later in the middle game, trying to build a 2 pawns center. So this move is very natural, but it's like you are quitting from creating a 2 pawns center with this idea of c3 and d4. The other option here is d4, and this is actually very interesting. It's Mackenzie variation, and this is aggressive, more dynamic, and for tactical players it might be a really good option. In general, white is not really getting much in this line if black knows the line, but very often black doesn't, so that's why it's interesting. So finally, let's get into the main line, and it is when white just castles here. They don't really defend the pawn because taking that pawn is actually risky, as the king is still in the center. It still takes 1 move to be able to castle because they need to develop the bishop. The knight is going to be hanging unprotected there on e4, so there are many ideas with the open file and the pressure over there. So white just decides to castle in the main line, and it's totally okay, it's totally justified here. Main option for black, bishop e7, just develop, get ready to castle. But options here, alternatives in this position are they can just accept the pawn on e4, and this is what we call open Ruy Lopez. As the knight takes e4, the approach here for black is, I'm going to take the pawn, but I don't want an extra pawn. I'm going to give the pawn back. But the idea is that as white gets that pawn back, I'm going to develop quickly. They will waste some tempi getting the pawn back, and I can develop quickly. That's the idea. So for example, the line can continue with d4, counter-attacking in the center, b5, getting rid of the pressure over there, bishop b3, d5, and d takes e5. Then they develop bishop e6, defending that pawn. That's a very common order in the open Ruy Lopez. In general, white is slightly better in these positions. And the other alternative here is b5, bishop b3, and then these are Kantel's variations with either bishop b7 or bishop c5. Bishop c5 is a more modern approach. I can tell you that this is a line that I have played at professional level as a chess player, and I have really interesting performance with this. It's a line that I really enjoy. I have a video in my channel about how to play Archangel's variation with this setup, and I really recommend it. It's really interesting, really simplified and easy to understand. So take a look if you want to learn how to play Archangel's variation. Well, main line here, as I was saying, is going to be just bishop to e7, trying to develop very quickly, and now the capture of the pawn might be a real threat here, so we should do something about this pawn, and the main line this time is going to be rook to e1. Alternatives for white in this position. Well, queen e2 is warrior attack. The idea with this line is that instead of bringing the rook to e and keep the queen on d, we are going to do the opposite. The queen comes to e and the rook is coming to d. Why is this interesting? Well, because probably later, if you can actually play c3, d4, there might be some idea with the rook and the queen over there. So yeah, it's really interesting, really playable. That's an option. The other alternative for white in this position is going to be something like the delayed exchange variation. So I'm talking about bishop takes e6, and after d takes e6, we have the exchange variation, but in a delayed mode. And you might be thinking, well, why is this a good thing, right? Why is there a delayed exchange variation? Why is this better if it's just the exchange variation with a tempo down? Well, this line is interesting because black has been playing some moves that are not matching very well with this exchange line. Black has been playing knight f6 and also bishop e7, and both moves are not very well in the exchange line that we saw earlier. Remember that in those lines, black usually played f6, reinforcing the central pawn. So these positions for the knight and the bishop are a little awkward, so that's why the delayed exchange variation makes sense. So that's another option here, but let's focus on the main line when white plays here rook to e1. Here black should play b5, because let me tell you something, there is a real threat right now. The pawn on e4 is protected, so white might actually be taking here, removing the defender, and then taking the central pawn. So the threat that we created in move number 3 when we developed the bishop to b5 now is real. Now this is a real threat. We're actually removing the defender and taking the pawn on e5. So at this point, black should play b5. Then the bishop comes to b3, of course, and black just reinforces the central pawn with d6. This move is very interesting. Of course, they are developing, they are creating the chain of pawns, but also there might be ideas with knight a5 getting the bishop on b3. Let's talk about an alternative for black that is also extremely interesting, and it is to castle kingside here. One more time, the idea is that if you don't play d6, you might be able to play d5 in one move instead of d6, d5. So the idea here is that if white continues with a normal development for this line, for example c3, aiming for d4, there is this great line where black can play martial attack with d5. Martial attack was popularized in 1918 with an amazing match between Capablanca and Marshall. There is some mystery behind this game, but it looks like Marshall was preparing the game for a long time, and actually Capablanca was able to deal with the preparation of his opponent and actually won the game. So this line is very charming. Usually white captures here, knight takes d5, and the thing is that white is getting one pawn here, but black is going to get compensation. For example, knight takes knight, rook takes knight. They need to defend the knight that is threatened here, but then after d4, bishop d6, rook e1. Look at the position, white has some development problem, and also black pieces are targeting things over there. The queen is also coming over here. For example, queen h4 is a move, g3, queen h3, so weaknesses over there. So basically what happens is that there is an interesting compensation for black in this position for the pawn down. So this is very playable, extremely recommended for black, this martial attack. The problem is that white is not totally forced to get into the martial attack and accept the pawn. They can play anti-martial systems. For example, usually when they play h3, this is an anti-martial. Also a4 is an anti-martial. These lines with d5 are not going to work when white plays an anti-marshal system. Also, there is a d3, and finally there is d4 here. All these lines make the marshal attack look a little bad, so probably it's not going to work. So that's like the drawback of this line. When black castles, white is not totally forced to get into martial attack. They can actually prevent it. Well, the main line is going to be the 6, and as I was saying, they are getting the bishop here with knight a5, so white needs to play the move here c3, so they clear one square here for the bishop, and also c3 is a move that we want to play because we want to play the move d4. There's nothing better for black here than just castling kingside, and here we are ready to play d4 apparently, but let me tell you something. Once you play d4, there will be a lot of pressure on your center, and a key piece dealing with that pressure is going to be your knight on f3, not only defending your own pawn, also attacking the enemy pawn on e5. So if we play d4 right now, black is playing bishop g4, and this doesn't look so great. Black is able to get rid of the knight anytime they want. Also, there's a pin, so it's not going to be easy to deal with that pressure. So we need to play the move a3 before we actually play the break on d4. At this point, black has three main alternatives. Knight a5 is going to be the most popular line. It's what we call Chigorin defense. We're going to talk about it very quickly, but also let me show you, there is this line knight b8, retreating the knight on developing the knight, but it's actually very interesting. The whole point is that they are clearing space so they can actually play c5 later, control the center a little better, but also they are clearing this line so the bishop is better, and the knight is coming over d7, where it's still very effective and it's not blocking the other pieces like the bishop and the pawn. So for example, in this Breyer variation, white can continue with d4, and then let's say knight d7, then knight d2, bishop to b7. Observe, black wants to put pressure here in the center. That's something they can do very well with the knight on d7, not blocking the bishop. The line can continue with bishop c2 and then rook e8. There are ideas here like retreating the bishop to put pressure directly on e4. Well, that's Breyer variation. Also, there is another line here that we call Zaitsev, and it is with bishop to b7. It's a normal development, but also, you know, pressure in the center. This line can continue with, for example, d4, rook e8, and then after knight b, d2, for example, we can play bishop f8. One more time, there is some interesting pressure here on e4. The drawback of this line is that at this point, white can play this move knight to g5, which is putting so much pressure here, is forcing black to play rook f8. So basically, if black wants, they can repeat moves, unless black plays something different and they don't really play rook e8 anymore. But well, rook e8 is actually the best move, and there is a difference between rook e8 and the other options for black. So that's like the problem here. Probably if you play this line is because you are willing to accept a draw by repetition, which is not always an option. Finally, let's get into Chigorin variation, and it is this move knight to a5. You're getting a tempo by attacking the bishop, but one more time you are clearing the way, so you can actually play c5 anytime soon. After this, white is forced to play bishop to c2, and then of course pawn to c5, controlling the square d4 very well. White can still play d4 and break. Is still a very good option. I mean d4. And then there is some good pressure here on e5. In general, black doesn't want just to trade pieces. For example, pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes. Let's say knight takes. This is not really looking very well for black. They have a weak pawn here. Also, nice square here for white pieces. In general, this position should be very comfortable for white. So actually, they just play here a defensive move, protecting the pawn on e5. That defensive move is queen to c7. Controlling over here, also clearing the square d8 for the rook. So that's how this line works. Also, very often this file can be open, and there might be some ideas with the pressure over there. So that's how this Chigorin variation works. So basically, this is Ruy Lopez move by move, everything during the main line and also in some alternative variations, some of the most popular lines that both sides can try. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any question, let me know in the comments. check out this video over here. I'm sure you will enjoy it. Thank you guys. Like, subscribe, play the right move. See you on the next.